So, it's been a little while since I put something up. Thought I should real quick. The other night, I was just kind of giving some thought to a question that I've kind of thought about seriously for the first time in a theological sense when I was maybe 19. It's kind of an interesting problem. So, it kind of has to do with the idea like, uh, if you know the future, are you free to change the future? If you change it, does that mean you didn't really know the future? Right? Uh, but most people really don't apply that question theologically. Because classically, most theologians are going to say that God has the attributes of both omniscience and omnipotence. So, surely any definition of omnipotence is going to include, free will, the ability to act in a way that affects the outcome of events in any way you choose, right? And omniscience, by most definitions, is going to include, foreknowledge, knowing what's going to happen. And there seems to be a conflict there because if God knows what's going to happen, then does that mean that God Himself is not uh, free to change the future, right? Because if He knows what's going to happen with certainty, then that means the future is certain and everything is determined, including everything God's going to do, right? So if God has omniscience, does He also have free will? That seems to be kind of a problem, right? And if God can change the future, that means the future is uncertain, which makes the future unknowable. Does that compromise God's omniscience? Um, I think there might be a way around that second problem. You could say that omniscience is knowing everything, right? Knowing everything that is, knowing everything that is knowable, right? Uh, so, in a sense, you could maybe argue that it's not really a limit on God's omniscience to not know the future if the future is uncertain, because that essentially means the future doesn't exist. So you still know everything, you know everything that exists. It's just you don't know non existent things, right? It's like if you know everything in the world, and I say, well, do you know something that isn't in the world? You get what I'm saying? It's like you posit some kind of meta reality where there are categories that wouldn't be included within the category of everything in the world. Yeah, you get what I'm saying, right? Um, but I remember thinking about that when I was like 19, and I was kind of like starting to question, a lot of religious ideas and stuff, and I was kind of thinking about theological questions in kind of a more skeptical, critical kind of way. And that was something I came across where I'm like, is that maybe a valid argument against like the God of the Bible, for example, or something? And I'll talk about that briefly, but I kind of want to talk about kind of how I view the question now, in light of my own like philosophical and theological positions. I mean, without question, the God of the Bible is portrayed as changing his mind, right? So, I mean, he creates the world and everything. He says it's good and, the fall, whatever else. But eventually, uh, you have the whole Noah and the flood thing, and he decides to, flood the earth. And then later, um, well, there's a verse in there where it basically says he looks at how evil man is, and it basically says he regrets uh, creating man. And is it really possible for an omniscient being to have regrets? Because if God knew the future, he knew, well, that's what mankind would become, and you made them anyway. So how can you say you have any regrets if you're an omniscient, omnipotent being? So it seems like the God of the Bible, of the Old Testament, seems to fail on either omniscience or omnipotence, one of the two in that case. And then there's things like when he's going to destroy, Sodom and Gomorrah or whatever, and Abraham like beseeches him to spare the city if he can find but 50 righteous men. And well, what about just for 20? What about just for 10? And you know what I'm saying? And there's definitely cases in the Bible where, God seems to be swayed. He was going to do one thing. He was going to bring judgment against someone or some people, and he's persuaded to change his mind, right? So there, I guess you could get into some kind of convoluted reasoning where it's like, yes, but he knew that Abraham was gonna like ask him to spare the city, and he knew that, you know what I'm saying? He knew that so and so would repent and that he would forgive them and hold back his wrath or whatever. But the Bible itself doesn't necessarily seem to portray it that way. If we just look at the Bible stories as they're told, it really does seem as if it is portraying a God that changes his mind and sometimes has regrets and was going to do one thing. So, presumably, when he was intending to do that one thing, his foreknowledge would foresee him doing that thing, and then later it turns out he does a different thing, and therefore the future is changed. So you would say, well, does he really have knowledge of the future then, right? Especially if he regrets his own actions, as is the case with, creating man or whatever. um, but of course, there's a lot to criticize about like literal interpretations of ancient religious text, right? So I just thought I'd give some of my own thoughts on this. So, number one, it's possible to kind of flip this objection on its head and say, no, it's not necessarily that, God's omniscience conflicts or contradicts his omnipotence. It logically follows from it. Because and I'm not really talking about the God of the Bible here necessarily, I'm just talking about more of a philosophical kind of God. If there is an all-powerful being, an omnipotent being, then basically whatever he wills, whatever he intends, is what's going to be. If nothing is outside of his power to control, then of course the future is within his power to control, and it will unfold as he wills it to. And so, of course, he's going to have foreknowledge, just like I intend to pick up this can of Bud Light Chelada and take another sip. Turns out that's exactly what happened because I willed it to be, and I had the power to, manifest my will. So, like I said, with an all-powerful being, foreknowledge seems to kind of follow from that. And someone might object, oh, well, is he free to change his will? And if not, does that conflict with his omnipotence? No, I'm kind of a compatibilist in terms of that, because God has classical theology, kind of the God of Plato or something like that. God is also immutable, right? He has an unchanging nature. And you can go back to old Platonic arguments, right? If something is perfect, can it really change, right? And I mean, Plato and a lot of other philosophers in that vein have argued that God is necessarily immutable, has an unchanging nature. The will just flows from nature. You know what I'm saying? Uh, Out of the desires of the heart, all of our actions, behaviors, and thoughts arise, right? So, why would God ever will himself to do anything or choose anything that's contrary to his nature, right? So, if he has an eternal, unchanging nature because he's perfect, he's God, then of course his will is unchanging. So, whatever he wills to happen, whatever he wills to be, which is what's in accord with his nature, that will be. And it's not necessarily a question of is he free to do otherwise, it's why would he? That's what he wills. His will is a product of his eternal nature, which is unchanging. And why would he will himself to be different from what he is if he is perfect? You get what I'm saying? So when we look at the problem in that way, I think it kind of goes away. And I think we can see that omniscience and omnipotence and immutability are not mutually contradictory. They're actually kind of one kind of requires the other in a way. So I'm going to leave it there for a while. I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought it was kind of an interesting, philosophical, question to kind of think about. Uh, Consider it. You may have some interesting thoughts of your own. I'm just putting it out there as food for thought more than anything else. So thanks for listening. Have a good one. Peace.